Beck is literally a genre. I label his tracks in my iTunes with a genre label of Beck. His latest album, Hyperspace, is the result of a collaboration with Pharrell Williams. So do we get more genre-defying genius? Let's get into my review. Hello friendly people of the internet. If this is your first time here, be sure to subscribe to this channel for your regular dose of positivity on things a lot of people think suck. So Hyperspace sees Beck collaborating with Pharrell Williams, which made me happy. Modern Beck is exactly what I want from music. Music that pushes the genre boundaries, incorporating modern electro stuff with strong instrumentation and songwriting. I find it hard to find stuff that fits this criteria, so it's awesome to see a team up between a singer-songwriter like Beck and a producer like Pharrell. Let's get into the track breakdown. I have mixed feelings on album openers. When they're short instrumentals, they can add a lot of value to an album that has consistent concepts carried throughout. Morning Phase's introduction track Cycle plays really nicely into the track Morning. I would almost say they sound like one song. Hyperlife doesn't really do that as an album opener. It's short and skippable, and it fades out before really going anywhere. It does introduce some musical ideas that are explored in the following track, Uneventful Days, but I didn't feel like it really worked as an album opener, and I would consider it skippable overall. The next track, Uneventful Days, is awesome lyrically. Uneventful days, uneventful nights, living in that dark, waiting for the light. Taken literally, to me, this track seems to be about how life can just be so damn boring. Life has this way of beating us into mediocre humans that just kind of go through the motions with things. So whether it intends to or not, this track really spoke to me on that level. Saw Lightning sounds like every genre of music thrown into a blender, and the result that comes out somehow makes sense. This is a great track to show someone who's never heard of Beck just what Beck is. There's slide guitar and harmonica, folk roots, there's rap, electro, rock, there's even a weird 8-bit sounding solo. Also, if my wife walks in and says, "What the f*** are you listening to?" I know I've stumbled upon a gem. My only gripe with this track is that it feels really out of place on the album, and the contrast between this track and the rest is actually kind of jarring. Die Waiting is a perfect blend of modern sounds and classic sounding Beck. There's a strong beat with some acoustic work, a recognizable bass line with really airy and catchy chorus, which is arguably a little too poppy at times, but this song really is the only one of its kind on this album, so I'm really happy with it. The next track on the album, Chemical, is probably one of my favorites on this album. There's snap tracks, drum programming, acoustic strumming, electric riffs, soaring vocals. This is what I was hoping for from this album when it was announced. There are segments where it's just Beck strumming an acoustic guitar and singing over a snap track, but then we get a bridge that sounds like a subtle Beck interpretation of mumble rap with short bursts of "I can feel it, minute." I thought the track See-Through maybe went a little too far in the overt hip-hop top 40s direction, and the repetitive, somewhat generic lyrics and kind of cringy yaz at the end were quite off-putting. Having said that, it's actually quite a bit more consistent with the vibe developed up until this point in the album. The tracks that follow this song see a drastic shift to a more psychedelic and down-tempo vibe. There really isn't much to the title track Hyperspace aside from an ascending synth melody and a rap section where there's some awesome nonsense rhyming happening where Beck seems to be just saying 3-syllable words that rhyme or near rhyme with hyperspace, one of which was gamma rays. This track features Terrell Hines, who I wasn't familiar with until I heard this song. After some research, I managed to find a 3-track EP that has some genre-bending elements to it, so it's worth checking out. The next track, Stratosphere, has a slightly more dynamic feel to it than Hyperspace does. There's a really nice clean picking throughout that really makes you feel like you're just kind of floating weightless in space. Dark Places stands out as probably the strongest and dynamic of these 3 psychedelic tracks, but I felt like at this point in the album I was ready for something a little less trippy and was longing for a track a little bit more similar to the first half of the album. Which is great because the next track, Star, carries an infectious groove which injects a much needed tempo and energy boost into this album. There's some subtle dynamics in this track that made this a really interesting listen for me after 3 much less dynamic tracks. The hi-hat changes in the verse, the swelling, sloppy electric licks give this song a real sense of personality. We then reach the closing track, Everlasting Nothing, which kind of reminded me of something from Morning Phase, slower, acoustic, and sung in Beck's lower vocal range. This song does kind of lag and loses momentum in the middle. There's a big folky build at the end which leads into a drop with a click track, which reminded me that this is an album closer for an album that had a lot of life to it, but really kind of lost it in the closing half of the album. Overall, Hyperspace feels a little disjointed and confused with what it wants to be. There are great moments of experimentation where we see an interaction of the creative energies Beck and Pharrell both bring to the table, but when considering the entire album, I found I really only enjoyed discovering each track until the midpoint, where the album really enters this trippy psychedelic lull that it doesn't really ever leave. The second half contains enjoyable enough songs, but they felt disconnected from the first half, and it feels like the intensity and energy levels are really just strangely distributed across the album. When I assess an album as a whole, I try to separate myself from the individual tracks and focus more on how they interact to form the album itself. That said, this wasn't really an album where I could do that. I found myself enjoying most of the tracks on the album, but I felt like I'll have to listen to them in different playlists for different occasions. What do you guys think? Is this an album that's divided with itself, or did you feel that it was more consistent in tone than I seem to have thought it was? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching.